The Großkampfwagen, also known as K-Wagen for short, was a super heavy tank developed for the Imperial German Army in 1917, near the end of the First World War, with the purpose of breaking through the stalemate of trench warfare that had already cost both the Entente and the Central Powers many lives. It was an enormous vehicle reminiscent more of a land battleship rather than a tank. Only two were partially built by the end of the war. Welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host, Dan, and today I'll be covering the German Großkampfwagen tank of the First World War. If you like what we do, remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single video. If you want to contribute more directly, consider donating to Patreon or PayPal. Every cent helps us keep the lights on. The First World War on the Western Front was fought mainly using extensive and well-defended trench systems. Thus, the front was mainly characterized by slow advances from both sides that were either too costly or too insignificant to make a real change on the battlefield. During the First World War, both the Central Powers and the Entente started developing their own designs of tanks, or tracked gun platforms, to achieve a breakthrough in each other's lines by using the firepower and mobility of these vehicles. The Germans managed to field only a very small number of domestically designed and built machines due to a lack of incentive and materials. The tanks that were put into action by the Allies remained, in general, tied to an infantry support role and served as a form of mobile pillbox. By 1918, both sides were making plans for a new generation of tanks that would play a decisive role in 1919, each hoping to break the deadlock on the battlefield. The German General Staff took little interest in tanks during 1917, focusing more on specialized infantry known as Sturmtruppen, who would infiltrate the enemy lines and take trenches with the use of grenades and flanking maneuvers. However, improvements in British tanks and the need to return to the offensive in the West provoked new policies in 1917. The slowly evolving German A7V was ordered into a low-rate production in early 1917, but other designs were already being made before it was even ready. A supporting super heavy tank was proposed to augment the A7V, the Großkampfwagen. The construction of the new tank was meant to be ready for an upcoming offensive that was planned, but the tank wasn't completed in time. The original design of the K-Wagen was made by Captain Vega, while detailed building plans were further worked out by Reserve Captain and Chief Engineer Wilhelm Adolf Theodor Müller. On March 31, 1917, this design was submitted to the War Ministry by the Department of the Chief of Field Vehicles. This department was established on 15 December 1916 and placed under direct control of the German Great Headquarters. It was tasked with managing all automotive matters, including the construction of armored vehicles. The ministry initially rejected the design, not based upon its characteristics, but because it wanted to await the test results of the A7V. After rejection, a special commission was formed which, on April 28, 1917, in the meantime, further news about British and French combat vehicles became available, so greater attention was paid by the Germans to their own developments. On June 28, 1917, the construction of 10 vehicles was approved by the War Ministry. From the very start of the design process, multiple issues started to arise. Most of these problems came from the fact that the requirements were illogical, given the production capacity and the lack of raw materials at the time. Such requirements were a trench-crossing capacity of 4 meters, an armament of 1 or 2 semi-automatic cannon that were to be between 5 to 7 centimeters in caliber, 4 machine guns, 2 flamethrowers, and an 18-man crew. The armament was to be fitted in sponsons and rotatable turrets, assuring fire coverage of 360 degrees, while armor thickness would range from 30 mm on the front and sides, 20 mm on the roof, and 10 mm on the floor. All of this, which was estimated to weigh around 100 tons, would be powered by 400 horsepower that came from 2 separate 200 horsepower motors. It was feared that the huge vehicle would be obliterated by enemy artillery fire as it moved slowly across no man's land, which troubled a lot of technicians. Other important issues were the fact that this was a completely new design, meaning that no previous manufacturing techniques could be utilized to ease production. One of the first issues to be addressed was the inadequate engine power. so the two 200-horsepower motors were replaced by a pair of 650-horsepower Daimler engines instead, allowing the vehicle to reach a theoretical maximum speed of 7.5 kilometers per hour. This more than tripled the available power, but increased the weight significantly. Due to all the issues that had constantly to be fixed, the design was changed many times, prolonging the production of the first two vehicles. By November 1917, their completion was far from in sight. As the development continued and the German army was getting rather more experience on tank warfare and design from the A-7Vs and the captured British tanks, some doubts started to arise as to the practicality of the K-Wagen. Specifically, on October the 18th, 1917, the test department of the Field Vehicle Office stated that the K-Wagen was more suitable for positional warfare, which completely undermined the reason that this vehicle was designed in the first place. On 20th November 1917 came the darkest day of the German army in the First World War with the Battle of Cambrai. The British attacked with 8 divisions and 365 Mark IV tanks. They achieved a breakthrough of a width of 13 kilometers and a depth of 9 kilometers. 8,000 prisoners and about 100 guns fell into their hands. Admittedly, the Germans succeeded in taking the terrain back by 7th December. The shock of the largest, and initially most successful, combat vehicle deployment to date must have left quite the impression on the Germans. This brought the Germans to the realization of the usefulness of the tank. The War Ministry had not yet made up its mind definitively at this point. In a note dated 17th July 1918, the following can be found. K-Wagen and other models are still under construction. The discussion about the K-Wagen continued for several months. After the A-7V was considered to be discontinued, the K-Wagen would provide the solution. But the decision in favor of a smaller combat vehicle was so pronounced that it is no longer mentioned in the large program of October 23, 1918 for future weapons production. The idea of creating a super-heavy armored fighting vehicle had died. The K-Wagen was 13 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 2.7 to 3 meters high. These dimensions gave the vehicle an enormous weight of 120 tons. Originally, the tank was designed to be longer and thus heavier, reaching roughly 150 tons, but due to the redesign and a shortening of the hull, the total weight was reduced to the 120-ton mark. Even though it was based on the general design of the British Mark tanks, the K-Wagen was far from a copy and had many original features. The hull was sprung onto the track plates on locomotive springs, and the tracks were unusual in carrying rollers on the track plates, instead of running over fixed rollers. For the electrical communication and control equipment, naval experience came into play since it was the same system as used on U-boats. The armor of the K-Wagen was 40 mm on the front, consisting of 2 separate 20 mm plates that were stacked together, 30 mm on the sides, another 20 mm on the rear and roof, and 10 mm on the floor. The K-Wagen was originally required to carry cannons, machine guns, and flamethrowers, but as development continued, the flamethrowers were cut. As for the cannons, the Artillery Test Commission provided 7.7 cm guns from the Idstein Fortress. They were chosen because they had a recoil length of only 40 cm and therefore seemed suitable for the narrow fighting area. 4 of these guns were assembled in their 2 side compartments, each of which housed 2 guns, one gun firing forwards while the other fired to the rear, giving the vehicle the capability to fire 360 degrees. The ranges of the individual guns crossed each other. The accommodation in the Swansons limited the firing elevation, but still allowed to fire at ranges of up to 6,400 meters. Ammunition provided for the guns included 800 rounds for the cannons and 12,000 rounds for the 7.92 mm Maxim MG-0815 machine guns. Each cannon was accompanied by a cylindrical shield that had a long vertical slit that provided the gunner with a clear line of sight. Additionally, at the left of each gun, above the cam lock, an aiming scope could be found as the gunner was seated on the left. The elevation and aiming mechanisms were all hand-cranked using hand wheels for traverse. Due to the limited space, these wheels had to be arranged concentrically, so that there was enough space left for the lateral swiveling of the gun. The operation of the hand wheels was therefore very uncomfortable. The tank was crewed by 27 men. The driver's compartment was located in the front of the tank and housed 2 drivers and 2 machine gunners with 3 machine guns. Each driver probably would have control over one side of the vehicle's gearbox, engine, and transmission. The fighting compartment was located behind it, featuring a cylindrical commander's cupola on the roof that accommodated the commander and an artillery officer. Due to the placement of the cupola, they had a large area of dead space around the rear of the tank which could not be observed from the cupola. Behind that, there was a signalman. Further back, the engine compartment equipped with 2 mechanics, and at the end there was a gearbox compartment. The artillery cannons required 12 people for their operation, 3 per gun, and the rest of the crew, 6 people, were allocated to operate the machine guns on the side sponsons of the vehicle, 2 soldiers per front-facing machine gun, and 1 soldier for the remaining rear-facing ones. The K-Wagen would be operated like a true land ship. The commander and the artillery officer observed from their cupola, analogous to a bridge on a warship, and issued orders to the 2 drivers, who had no vision ports of their own. They also issued orders to their batteries of guns and machine guns to engage targets. The way that these orders were given was through the use of light signals. The tank was made from 4 dismountable basic parts that weighed around 30 tons each, that were going to be transported via rail, then loaded into lorries in loads of approximately 8 tons, and then assembled about 6 kilometers behind the front. In addition to the 30 trucks required, cranes, hoists, and electric motors, etc. were also needed. This was made to ease the transportation of the massive vehicle. 2 of these vehicles were almost near completion by the end of the war and were supposed to be used for the upcoming operations of 1919. 2 of them were located at Berlin-Weissensee in the Reibe-Kugellager factory and were near completion, while an armored body was completed at Wegmann Carriage Works at Kassel. The ones at the Reibe factory were so close to completion that one of them was basically ready to undergo trials, but none were allowed to leave the factory since the war ended and the Allied Control Commission ordered both of them to be destroyed. The K-Wagen was a very ambitious project that was doomed to fail from the beginning, since Germany did not yet have the experience and the industrial capacity to produce sufficient numbers of these vehicles. And even if they had, their combat effectiveness would be questionable since it had many design flaws. It still remains admirable, though, that, despite all the difficulties the project faced, it still managed to be put into production and have one almost ready for testing. Unfortunately, we will never be able to know how this landship would have performed against the battlefield, since it was not allowed to be finished and tested by the Allies. This concludes our video on the K-Wagen. If you like what we do and want to see more, remember to subscribe so that you don't miss a single video. If you want to contribute more directly, consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. It helps us to keep the lights on and allows us to improve the quality of our videos. Until next time, keep us in your sights.